Okay, everybody. Once again, this is Ron Brown, and we are continuing with this exciting series on the great cities of the world. As most of you know, I've been everywhere, and I never talk about a city unless I haven't been there. And so Bangkok, I was there twice already. And hopefully I'll go back sometime once airlines get working again and life gets back to normal. If it ever gets back to normal, I don't know. But once again, we will be taking a virtual tour of Bangkok. And as usual, with my little side stories and stuff, because I think a city is more than just buildings and history. But when someone has been there and experienced certain things, it really adds a whole new dimension to it. So it is called the City of Gold because, as we're going to see, all of the Buddhist temples are gold covered. The domes just radiate in the sun, and it's absolutely a city where whenever you're walking around at any time of day, the city has a different color because the rising sun striking a dome makes it a different color. At high noon, it's different. In the evening, it's different. If there are clouds, the whole city just changes its color. So once again, this is the outline what we're going to do. I usually speak for about an hour and then we throw it open to questions and comments and criticisms or whatever. So to begin, we'll talk about the peoples of Asia. I mean, when we talk about Europe, everybody knows the Swedes are different from Italians and Spanish are different from Greeks and Russians. But when it comes to Asia, as most people say, all Asians look alike. We can't really recognize the difference between a Korean, a Japanese, a Chinese, or a Vietnamese. Although for Asians, the difference is night and day. And so I will give a little bit of background of the various peoples of Asia. The relationship with China. Very important today as China is merging as the major world power, followed by the founding of Bangkok. Like many cities, there's an interesting history there, and it was not all that old as an ancient city. Number 4, staying independent, how Thailand and its kings were able to negotiate the great power expansion and remain independent. It was never colonized by the French or the Russians or the Americans. Then my first visit to Thailand, my second in 2016, when I was there for the funeral of the recently deceased king. And then one of the things that really just blew my mind were the many calendars of Thailand. So let's get going. Now, once again, there's me at a candy store in Bangkok, and you can see I let my hair grow, but that's still the same old me. If anybody has any comments or questions or would like to know my different schedule for lectures and stuff, just send me an email to ronbrownmedia@gmail.com, and we will have everything. I'll send you everything you need. And once again, this is the lovely Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library, where I haven't been for a good many months in the auditorium and meeting all of you, but hopefully sometime in the near future, we will be back at the library. Now, to begin, we all know a lot about Thailand. What's our source of knowledge for Thailand? Well, of course, Siam is the ancient name of Thailand, and we know the Siamese cats, which, like the Chinese and their poodles and the Germans and their dogs, breeding, crossbreeding animals is part of the Thai culture. And the Siamese cat, with its blue eyes and its black and white fur, have been bred and crossbred and cultivated over 1,000 years to reach this wonderful Siamese cat. Well, we all know about the Siamese twins. These were Chang and Eng, who were from China, even from Thailand, even though they were ethnic Chinese, But as we're going to see in a minute, they became really the sensation of circuses in the United States. And then, of course, we all know Anna and the King of Siam, this romanticized story which is really with Irene Dunn and Rex Harrison, which has really brought, once again, Chinese to the main screen. But of course, beyond these three claims to fame, most people know a little bit about Thailand, or its ancient name, Siam. So let's begin. Now, if you look at the map on the left, you see down in the bottom left-hand corner, there's this blue area not far from Vietnam and from other Asian countries. North is the yellow, which is China, and on the left is the blue and the greenish color, which is India. Well, the Thais are part of what we call Sino-Tibetan family. These are the peoples of China, Tibet, Burma, and Thailand. So the Thais are first cousins to the Chinese. And the Sino-Tibetans are is probably the largest ethnic family and linguistic family on the face of the earth. You combine the China, Tibet, Burma, and Thailand, I mean, you have close to 2 billion people. Now, other language and cultural families are the Semitic, where we have Israel, Arabia, Jordan, and the Semitic peoples of the Middle East. Indo-Europeans, these are Iran, India, Pakistan, Russia, the United States, and all of Europe. We are the Indo-European. Turkic family, Central Asia, and the smaller family, the Austronesian, are Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Now, if you look closely at the map, I'm sure you could all find Thailand there, the blue part. But if you look closely, you'll see that there appear to be more Thai-speaking people still in China than there are in Thailand. Well, it was only during the 10th century, these would be the 900s, when there was a great migration of people in Asia. These are sort of like when Attila the Hun went gallivanting out of Mongolia into Europe, or the Turks, or the great migrations of the barbarians which toppled the Roman Empire. Every once in a while, a bunch of people in the world decide to get up and leave and migrate somewhere else. Well, in the 10th century, the Thai people who lived in southern China, for some strange reason, decided that they just wanted to move. Maybe it's because it was further south and they liked more palm trees than they had in China. So in the 10th century, they started migrating south, conquering all the people in their path. And on the right, we see the dark areas, which are the Thai people. Burma has a huge Thai population. Laos is predominantly Thai-speaking people. And then the other areas up into China is the original homeland of the Thai people. Well, they were going through a glorious moment when they decided to leave China and migrate south, and they established a great Ayutthaya kingdom in the 13th century, which lasted for hundreds of years. Now, that was their first golden age, when the Thai people entered history with their first great empire. Well, the Thai people, and you can see the map on the left, you see Thailand, which is sort of a lighter yellow. They were part of not the Chinese civilization, but of Indian civilization. When the people left China, they settled in Thailand. They started trading and doing business with the peoples of India. And so the first religion of Thailand was not Buddhism. So all those gold Buddhist temples that just dominate are a later addition. Originally, the Thais converted to Hinduism. Now, the great Indus Valley civilization, which was the founding of the Hindu civilization 3 to 4,000 years BC or BCE, this civilization flourished. They spoke Sanskrit, they had all of their different gods, and they spread out of northern India. The middle picture there shows the Indus Valley civilization, today in India and Pakistan, and the Hindus spread and converted the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Thais, the Indonesians, the Malaysians. Afghanistan was one of the glories of Hinduism. Today it's all Muslim. Thailand was one of the high points of Hindu civilization. Today they're all Buddhist. And so we don't know much about the Hindu civilizations of the Indus Valley, but it produced a flourishing culture. Well, when the Hindus got to Thailand and Indonesia and Cambodia, of course, the first thing they did was built giant Hindu temples. Well, of course, Hinduism came from northern India, up in the Himalaya mountains. Well, in Thailand and in Cambodia and in Indonesia, there were no mountains. So what did these good, faithful Hindus do? They built artificial mountains. And here on the left, we see Borobudur, the great Hindu temple of Indonesia, built in 750 AD. Angkor Wat on the right in Cambodia, which I visited several years ago, dates from the 12th century. And these were the great Hindu temples, which covered from Afghanistan the whole way down to Indonesia and Malaysia, building temples to worship the many gods of the Hindus. Well, the first great king of the Thais was Khamhaeng the Great, who ruled from 1279 to 1298. And he was the one who developed the unique Thai alphabet with all of its little curly cues. I mean, it's sort of, see, there are no roots in Greek or Latin or Cyrillic or any other of our languages, but he was the one who united Thailand, imposed Hinduism on the people, taught them how to read and write, first Sanskrit and then their own Thai language. And as an instrument of instruction, he made these giant pillars, which we see in the middle, with inscriptions in the new Thai alphabet, which he built throughout the country. And that's the alphabet which we still use today. So you see, even ordinary things like fire exit are written in the Thai alphabet. Now, the Thai alphabet is, as you can see from the on the right side, there are vowels and there are consonants, meaning it is phonetic. It is like Hebrew and like Arabic and English and French. It's not a picture language as the Chinese have and the ancient Egyptians, but it is a phonetic alphabet. So once you learn the alphabet, you can read fire exit, but I have no idea what it sounds like. But it's definitely not fire exit, but that's what it means. So under King Rama, Khamhaeng the Great, in what is European Middle Ages, the Thai culture flourished. The first united Thai kingdom, again, another great king, was King Uthong, and second great king of Thailand, who ruled from 1351 to 1369. Now here we see statues of him. We see the stupas. which were Hindu and later Buddhist temples, once again recreating the sacred Hindu mountains of northern India. Now, here again, when you look at the architecture, they're like a Gothic church, like St. Patrick's on Fifth Avenue. Architecture points upward, meaning all religions believe that God or the gods live in heaven. And so you climb up the mountain to find your God. Where did Moses go to meet God and get the 10 Commandments? Went up to Mount Sinai. So once again, mountains, whether they're real mountains like Mount Sinai, or the mountains of the Himalayas for the Hindus, or artificial mountains like the Hindu and Buddhist temples of Cambodia or St. Patrick's Cathedral, mountains are considered the sacred abode of the gods. Now, for centuries, Ayutthaya was the capital of Thailand, not Bangkok. Ayutthaya is a good distance north of Bangkok, closer to the geographic center of Thailand. Now, even though the Thai people adopted Hinduism from India and were in the Hindu and Indian cultural sphere, they never forgot that their ancestors were from China. They were ethnically Chinese. And so whenever a king of Thailand would be crowned, he would send a delegation to the emperor in Beijing and ask for his blessing and his recognition. This is called the Chinese tributary system. The red dot in the middle, the darkest dot, that is Beijing. Going out from Beijing, you have the Han Chinese, and you have the other Chinese. Then you have the distant Chinese, such as the Koreans and even the Japanese and the Thais and the Burmese. The next circle going out are the non-Chinese people. These would be the people of India, the Arabs, the Europeans. And the outermost circle of the Middle Kingdom are what they call barbarians. These are people who have had no cultural ties with China and are still considered semi-barbarians. That is me and probably everybody listening to me today. We have not been civilized by the Middle Kingdom. But the Thais have been part of this tributary system for thousands of years. They have never forgot that they are of Chinese ethnic background. Well, the early Thai kingdoms centered around their capital city of Ayutthaya, which is today a very romantic ruins north of Bangkok. They were invaded in 1767, shortly before the American Revolution, and the kingdom was destroyed. And you had the kingdom of Greater Burma, which ruled over what is today Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, down into Malaysia, and up into India. Another glorious kingdom in South Asia, but destroyed the city of Ayutthaya. They burned it to the ground, and today it is just one of these cities of ruins. Well, under King Rama I, who we see on the left in 1782, the Thais rose up in revolt against the Burmese, expelled them, and refounded the independent kingdom of Thailand. And to celebrate the new independence of Thai kingdom, King Rama I, who ruled from 1782 to 1809, reestablished Thai independence, and he built a new capital to celebrate this great event. And that is the birthday of Bangkok, 1782. Now, this is not at all unusual. Think of Peter the Great saying, I am going to launch a new age in Russia. He abandoned Moscow and he built his new capital of St. Petersburg. What did the United States do when it was independent? It didn't want any colonial city like New York or Boston or Philadelphia or Charleston with all of its colonial baggage. They built a brand new city in Greek and Roman architecture, which is today Washington, D.C. Last January, I was in Brasilia when Brazil broke its ties with Portugal and Europe and said, we are entering the new golden age of the future of Brazil. What did the president do? Built a brand new city in the middle of Brazil, naming it Brasilia, the city of the future. So King Rama I began the Chakri dynasty, which lasts until today. In fact, Thailand has been in the news again because the new king, the young king, who we are going to meet in a couple of minutes, decided that he's going to put Thailand back on the map, seize power, and inhabits his magnificent palace, which we see in the center. The center of Bangkok is dominated by the imperial palaces. And there on the right, you see people taking pictures. Once again, we see here 3 golden domes recreating the mountains of the Himalayas where the gods lived. The abodes of the gods were in the Himalayas. And so if you don't have a mountain in your country, you build one. Now, Rama is the name of the king. That's the name the king takes. Rama is a Hindu god, one of the most important Hindu gods, who was born in the mountains of the Himalayas. And the king can still, until today, in spite of the fact of becoming Buddhist, still consider the royal family of Thailand a descendant of the god Rama, just like the emperor of Japan considers himself a descendant of the sun god. Now, the center of Thailand, it's built on the river, and you see there with the canal, there's a little island there, and the entire island is dominated by the Grand Palace. On the left at the bottom, you see a diagram showing the royal palace, the Buddhist temples, the stupas, and the various other palaces and functional buildings. On the right, you get a much more colorful picture, once again showing the golden domes, the white domes, the wall around the royal city, once again creating a veritable mountain range on a flat plain, reminiscent of the great mountains of the Himalayas, where the god Rama was born and is reincarnated in the kings of Thailand. One of the most famous buildings in Bangkok, which everybody must visit, is the Wat Phra Kaew, or the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. Now, Buddhism grew out of Hinduism. So in Thailand, people still venerate the many, many gods of Hinduism, but their main spiritual leader is, of course, the Buddha. He was not a god, even though he is almost deified, as you can see on these giant emerald statues, the Buddha sitting on a throne. And this temple is the oldest temple in Thailand. It was built by King Rama I. Now in Thai, Wat, W-A-T, is the word for temple. That's the way we translate it. And so once again, you see typical Thai architecture with the wings of birds and the flames of fire bursting up from the sides of the building, always dominated by towers to say that the abode of the gods, the land of the Buddha, the land of the Hindu gods, is in the Himalaya mountains. And so this is the temple of the Emerald Buddha with his crown. Once again, his crown is topped by the mountains of the Himalayas. And this is probably the most celebrated temple. Now, this temple goes back to 1782, but in Thailand, like in Japan and Asia in general, temples are like this are built of wood, which means there's probably not one stick of wood in the whole temple that dates back to 1782. Termites get added, a fire might damage a part might rot. And so these temples, even though they date from 1782 and are identical to the temple of 1782, they are still in a constant state of restoration and being rebuilt. Now, there are many, many gods in Asia. In fact, in Buddhism and Hinduism, they don't like the word God. They will use a sacred person because Buddhists don't have gods. They don't believe in gods. And Hindus have thousands of gods, but they're not gods in the Western sense. Gods are born, gods are die, gods die. Gods get married and have baby gods. Baby gods sometimes die or are killed or disappear. So God is really not the word we would use when you say the temple of God of Bangkok. It would be more or less the temple of the saint of Bangkok. Every city in Asia, in the Buddhist and Hindu world, has a temple to the god. I visited the god of Shanghai, who was a general who saved the city from barbarian invasion. And in Thanksgiving, the city council voted him a god. They built a temple, they established a priesthood, and they venerate him not so much as a god, but as a great hero. And that's the way it is with the god of Bangkok. It is the spirit that protects the god, a great hero. And once again, we see the blending of gold and white. That's the temple of the god of Bangkok. Interestingly, the center of the city is always the temple of the god of the city. So when you say Bangkok is so many miles from Shanghai, that means you measure from the temple of the god of Bangkok to the temple of the god of Shanghai. In many countries, when you see a sign distance, it could be from city hall to city hall. In Russia, it is the main post office to the main post office. So when you say Moscow is so many miles from Berlin, you would simply say from the main post office of Moscow to the main post office of Berlin. So this is different ways of measuring distances in different cultures. The temple on the right is the Temple of Dawn. Every temple is given a meaning. Now, of course, dawn, the rising of the sun, is considered an auspicious time. And so you venerate the spirit of dawn, just like you would venerate the spirit of the setting of the sun. Dawn is important. Synagogues and churches traditionally have faced the rising sun. In Africa until today, the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, all the people were buried so their eyes would see the rising sun, even in death. Now, Thailand entered history. It got rid of the Burmese and it had a second renaissance under King Rama the First and King Rama the Second. Thailand has this strange ability to stay independent. Sure, it recognized the Emperor of China as his sovereign, but they were an independent country. They were influenced by the Hindu culture of India, but they remained independent. Now, Thailand became famous when the Chinese sent, in the year 1405, Admiral Chang Hai to explore the known world. He built giant ships and sailed from China down throughout Indonesia, Malaysia, visited Thailand, up into modern India, and over into the Saudi Arabia, visited Mecca, and down to Africa. And so the Thais were part of this great Chinese imperial system where China dominated the world. Now, this is back in the 1400s. The Europeans are still fighting wars of religion, overthrowing kings. The Holy Roman Empire is in decline. It's also getting close to the time of Christopher Columbus. But Thailand was already a major power, sending out ships throughout the Indian Ocean. Well, the Thais respected the authority of the Emperor of China. They had great respect for the Hindu and Buddhist cultures coming from India, but they were never colonized by anybody. So then once they got rid of the Burmese, they remained independent. And when the Dutch and the French and the English and the Americans started taking over Asia, Thailand, or Siam as it is on the map, resisted them all. Burma became British. Malaysia became British. Indonesia became Dutch. The French took over Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. The Americans grabbed the Philippines from the Spanish as its Asian colony in 1895. But Thailand remained independent. Of course, the Americans had their eye on Thailand, the last independent country in Asia, and were ready to grab it. In fact, we see the famous war of the year 1900 when the United States was expanding in Asia, taking over the Philippines in 1898. In the year 1900, the Americans invaded China, burned half of Peking to the ground. We see the Great Battle of Peking. In the middle picture, see the American flag on the walls of the forbidden city of Peking. We looted the country, took everything we could get, but still the Thais managed to preserve their independence from the French, the Dutch, the British, and the Americans. And so it remained independent. And the Thais will always tell you, we were never colonized by Europe or America. During World War II, Thailand under King Rama the 8th, 1935, 1946, remained neutral. You see the map on the left, the Japanese taking over Korea, big chunks of China, kicking the Americans out of the Philippines, kicking the Dutch out of Indonesia, the British out of Malaysia and Burma, kicking the French out of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. But Thailand remained neutral. It did not fight with one side or the other. And for that, King Rama the 8th is highly loved and respected because he preserved the independence of Thailand even during the ravages of World War II. Well, Thailand remained independent, but it has suffered a lot. In 1932, the Americans intervened and they limited the power of the king and put in a typical beloved American military dictatorship. But still, the king resisted total American domination. And finally, in the year 2014, there was another coup. So the king always remained very powerful, even if weakened. It was never occupied by American troops directly. Even during the War of Vietnam, Thailand remained neutral because it was afraid that it would be either it would get involved in the war and the communists won, then it would be occupied by Russia and China. If the Americans won the Vietnam War, they would be occupied by the Americans. And so they remained neutral and preserved their independence. Even under pro-American military rule, American troops were not stationed there. Now, this is a fascinating country that I visited. Now, how did I get in Thailand? Well, Thailand is famous for older Europeans and Americans and Japanese to retire. It is cheap. The people are very friendly and cordial. The food is magnificent. Well, in the picture on the left, we see Bernard, who was my best friend when I lived in Switzerland for 7 years. I did my doctorate at the University of Geneva, and Bernard worked for Swissair. Well, when he retired and his parents passed on, he retired to Thailand. So that's Bernard on the left, who I got to know. And this is Bernard these days in Thailand, where he is now retired. So Thailand is awash with foreign tourists. Tourists and as well retired Europeans, Japanese, Americans, Canadians, because this lifestyle is so cheap, so comfortable, so easy going. Here we see downtown Bangkok, once again filled with beautiful architecture. Streets are packed with massage parlors, all kinds of candy stores, magnificent restaurants. And it is one of the most popular touristic cities. Unfortunately, today with the pandemic, it is not exactly booming, but still there are a lot of foreigners who live there, and they are keeping the economy going, even if the jumbo jets are not bringing over thousands of new tourists. Now, as most of you know, when I travel, I stay in hostels. If you're interested in cheap accommodation when you travel, you can see the Hostel Bangkok where I stayed. This is another one where I stayed in south of Bangkok in Hua Hin. And there is, of course, hostelworld.com. And the wonderful thing about a hostel is you meet wonderful people. You're in a room with 3 other people or more or less, depending, and you immediately get to know them. You swap stories. You go out to dinner together. You buy a 6-pack of beer, sit in the lobby, watch a movie on a big screen TV. You meet other travelers of all ages from all over the world. A lot of you think of youth hostels. Well, now it is hostel for everybody. One advice: if you're getting up there in years, don't try to negotiate the top bunk on a bunk bed. I always make it very clear when I reserve online, bottom bunk only. I'm not going to break my neck. Now, Bangkok is wonderful because there are so many one-day trips that you can take. Chang Mai in the north is the city of white temples, beautiful ornate gardens, and you're getting up into the mountain areas where you have a lot of mountain tribes, where they have their own traditions. Sometimes they even speak other languages, but that is a one-day trip, which is absolutely gorgeous. And if you're there in the hot season, which is our summer, it is a pleasant climate. Don't go to Bangkok in the summer. I always go in January when the weather is pleasant. Now, going to Angkor Wat, another cluster of Hindu temples, is more than a one-day trip, but it really celebrates the Hindu wealth of architecture that is shared by Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Burma. And you see once again how the trees, the ficus trees, have started overgrowing the temples. And they're starting to remove them and restore a lot of these temples going to the 12th century. South of Bangkok is the King's Royal Summer Palace. At the right, on the bottom, you see the king and the royal family's personal train station. So the king gets on his royal carriages and he goes down. He has received at his royal train station and is then taken by carriage to his royal palace. So Hua Hin is absolutely magnificent. On the map on the left, you see it is on the coast and the weather is gorgeous. Going out into the ocean are these long piers where you see thousands and thousands of tourists. Now, the top picture in the middle is another chapter of Thailand, which is very famous, and that is the sex trade. When you go to these piers, 90% of the time you see an older white or Japanese gentleman with one or two much younger Thai girls or Thai boys. This is a tradition in Thailand where some poor, unhappy, older white person shows up in Thailand. He will be adopted by a young girl and her family. Very often they'll get married. Very often they just live together. And it is a tradition that he's accepted as a member of the family. It's not considered prostitution, although that's what we would say it. How we would describe it in the West, where a 17, 18-year-old girl is shacking up with a 60 or 70-year-old gentleman. But it is the tradition. My friend Bernard has his younger Thai lover. Well, when I was visiting him, he was part of the family. I mean, he'd buy school books and uniforms for her brothers and sisters. He was constantly going to birthday parties and weddings. He was accepted as part of the family. And his relationship with his girlfriend was perfectly acceptable. It wasn't badly viewed. And so that's one of the characteristics of Thai. Sexually, they are very free and open. For gays and lesbians, it's a wonderful place. For older men who are interested in women, it's a very popular place. And it is just part of the tradition of hospitality. Although many Westerners with our Judeo-Christian Puritanism find it a bit unusual, to say the least, still in the Thai culture of the islands and the ocean, it is accepted. Now, my second visit to Bangkok was in 2016, 2017. And Rama the Eighth had died. Here we see his picture as a young man, 1946 to 2016. And this is on the right, his picture with his wife in his later years. Now, he had died just shortly before I got there. Now, that rather odd-looking guy in the middle is, as you can guess, this is Rama the Ninth. And he is, and if I was in Thailand and I'd say this, I'd be in jail for the rest of my life. But since I'm here in Queens, I can say it. He was described as the Playboy King. On the left, we see that he lived most of his life in France and Switzerland. with boats and castles and tattoo parlors. And he's gone through a succession of wives. He would be a bicyclist. Even today, it's the only country in the world that has honorary wives for the king, concubines, who have royal status and live in palaces, as well as his official legal wife. So when I was there and King Rama the Eighth died and Rama the Ninth took the throne, this was a very controversial time. He was considered to be ultra decadent and was considered to be not worthy of the throne, but he definitely took the throne. The king of Thailand is considered one of the top 5 richest men in the world, which is another issue. Now, after I left in May 5th, 2019, was the royal coronation, where you see him being carried through the streets of Bangkok by the royal bodyguards, receiving the blessing from a Buddhist monk. We see the throne room on the right, and his honor guard. And at the bottom, we see him in another one of the rooms in his palace with his #1 wife beside him, receiving the honors from other leading Thai people. Now, the death of a king is a long drawn out process. When I was there in 2017, his body was still being taken around the country. And it is believed that when the king dies, he returns to the mountains of the Himalaya, where he is accepted by the god Rama as one of his legitimate children, and he lives on forever as a deity in the Himalaya mountains. Now, the central tourist area where I always stay was Khao San Road. There's me again on one of the shops on Khao San Road, filled with bars, with clubs, with discotheques going non-stop. The only thing that the Thais will not tolerate are drugs. I mean, you can have alcohol, you can go with girls, you can go with boys, you can dance all night, you can get drunk, but drugs are viciously persecuted. One of the nice traditions of Thailand is where they have these little fish in these pools, and you pay so much money, and the fish give you a manicure, and they eat the dead cells off of your feet, and calluses they remove. They get even under the nails and clean out any debris which you have on your feet. And for some reason, that has become one of the most popular forms of entertainment. I never did it. I didn't find it all that interesting, but that's one of the things that it's a must do if you're in Thailand. I was there for Christmas, and once again, Christmas, like everywhere, is celebrated, whether it's Santa Claus arriving on an elephant, or in the islands, he arrives on a dolphin, or if he arrives in a limousine. It is still the same American style, red clothed Santa Claus that was invented by New York's very own Thomas Nast. Christmas trees, well, they don't have pine trees there, so they make artificial colored trees. You see stockings hanging on palm trees. So Christmas is part of the global holiday season. Now, one final thing which I found absolutely breathtaking was in Thailand, every group of people has its own calendar. The king was born was crowned and died and was buried according to the Hindu calendar. Remember, the king is King Rama the 9th or 10th, and it is Lord Rama. On the left, you see the blue-skinned god of Hinduism. Well, according to the Hindu calendar, the year is 2016. So Hinduism is really the religion of the king, even though he goes to a Buddhist priest or a Buddhist monk to be blessed. His calendar, his name, his divine status does not come from Buddhism, but it comes from Hinduism. So when you look at a calendar hanging on the wall in a store in Thailand, you have a little box with every calendar which is honored in Thailand. So the king, all of his official documents, all of his official events and holidays are according to the Hindu calendar. Well, of course, I was there for Christmas and I was there for New Year's. So the calendar also has the Western date. At the top of a newspaper, it will have the Hindu date, the Buddhist date, the Muslim date, and the Western date. So I was there December 31st, 2016 in Bangkok. We counted down the hours as the New Year began out in the middle of the Pacific, marched its way through the Phoenix Island, up into the Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands, finally getting to Australia. Well, I was in a bar, and when it was the Australian New Year, which was about 6 o'clock in the evening, the place just went wild with all the Australians screaming and yelling. Well, of course, I was there for the ball drop in Times Square, which was at 6 o'clock in the afternoon the following day. The French went crazy when it was New Year's in Paris. There was a gang of Russians which went crazy when it was Russian New Year in Moscow, buying everybody vodka. So needless to say, I didn't have to buy a drink until it was New Year's in New York, when I had to buy everybody in the bar a drink. So they also celebrate the Western New Year. The Times Square, New York was part of this global holiday season, which includes Christmas and New Year's. Now, when it is noon in Thailand, it is midnight in New York, which made it very easy to calculate the hour. When it's midnight in Thailand, it is 6 o'clock noon, 6 o'clock in the morning in New York. So you see the Khao San Palace where I celebrated New Year's. I mean, everybody spraying everybody else. When it was Thailand, Thai New Year's, they brought in the elephants who were spraying water on everybody to celebrate the Thai New Year. Well, this is the sacred mountain of Thailand. This is Mount Kailash, the abode of Lord Rama. And when the king died, and anybody from the royal family dies, they are transported to this mountain. And so according to the, I made a mistake there, according to the Hindu calendar, it is the year 3102. So you see the original mountain, Mount Kailash, which is reconstructed in all of the temples of Hinduism in Burma down to Indonesia. Now, the Buddhist calendar is also venerated. To celebrate one of the big Buddhist holidays, I went to the Wat Phra, and here we see the Temple of the Reclining Buddha. And you can see it is completely surrounded by beautiful buildings. And Buddha's birthday is a big holiday. The Chinese New Year is a big holiday. The death day of the Buddha is a major Thai holiday. So you have all these different calendars merging together. The Christian calendar. I happened to be there for the Feast of the Epiphany, the Feast of the Three Kings in Hua Hin. I went to this lovely church, which is in Hua Hin, because there's so many foreigners living there. They have a very lively Catholic community and a couple Christian Protestant churches. And of course, for them, the calendar was 2016. And so we were celebrating the Feast of the Three Kings. And so this was another calendar which is marked on all the wall calendars in Thailand. The Muslim calendar is also respected in Thailand. The whole southern part of Thailand, the map on the right, you see Hatay. It was the ancient emirate of Hatay. That area is thoroughly Muslim with beautiful mosques all over the place. You see the famous tourist island of Phuket to the north. I went there for one day and I left. I mean, it was terrible. The beaches are gorgeous, but they are mobbed with tourists. And I mean, if you want to see a 500-pound Russian woman wearing a string bikini, go to Phuket. I won't even describe the 500-pound Polish gentleman wearing a Speedo bathing suit, which is a sight for sore eyes. But that was Phuket. It was all discos and everything, nothing of historical interest for me. I spent one day and then I left and went down to Hatay, which was the Muslim section. Absolutely glorious architecture. And of course, they have their own calendar, which is marked on all the calendars of Thailand. And when I was there, it was the year 1437. So all of these calendars are marked on the calendar that you see in a store or a hotel in Bangkok. Well, there's one calendar that they don't mark yet, but it'll probably be marked the next time I go back, and that is the Jewish calendar. I was walking down the street and there was this bicycle going by, three-wheeled bicycle with big speakers on the back, and they were announcing in Hebrew and English and Thai that the Lubavitch Center, the Chabad house, was having its Friday evening services, and it would be followed by a free dinner. So for the year 5776, I went to the Chabad house, and since I speak Hebrew, since I lived in Israel for 5 years, I could pass as a Jew. So I got a free meal and everything and met a lot of Israelis. A lot of young Israelis have settled in Thailand. Many of them have taken on Thai wives. And this is quite an incident because some of them remain Jewish. Some of the girls convert to Judaism. Most of them do not, but you have a growing Thai-speaking Jewish community. Now, these are mostly young Israelis who are out for a good time, or a large number of young Israelis who don't want to go to the army and do occupation service in the West Bank or Gaza or East Jerusalem. And so they escape from Israel to Jordan, fly to Bangkok, and set up housekeeping there. They can't go back to Israel because they'd be arrested, but a growing Israeli community that the Lubavitchers have been cultivating. Well, of course, one major calendar that I was there for was the Chinese New Year. This is celebrated probably as much as Christmas. When I was there, it was the year of the rooster. And I mean, everybody was celebrating, having parties, eating, drinking, really celebrating the Chinese New Year. Now, here again, all of these calendars represent a very strong influence in Thai culture. If you are the king, you recognize that you are the descendant of the Hindu god, and your roots go back to the days when Thailand was a Hindu country. The majority of the people are Buddhist and celebrate the Buddhist holidays and consider themselves good Buddhists. You have a large number of Thai Christians who have converted to various Protestant and especially Catholic churches, not a huge number, but that is still part of the Thai reality with so many foreigners living there. And you have the Chinese influence, the Muslim influence, all part of this Thai culture, which in a way contributes to this openness, this friendliness, this openness to new ideas, this serious avoidance of getting involved in foreign wars, staying aloof from everybody, having no tradition of persecution for either ethnic or religious or cultural differences. So it is really one of those wonderful countries, and Bangkok is really one of the highlights of the world cultural heritage. So that once again, when flights are going again, and when the virus has been conquered, you should definitely put Thailand in one of your to visit places. So at this, I will draw this to an end, and I hope to see you in one of our future talks and visits to these absolutely magnificent places of the earth.